And for more on the NATO summit, let's go to Rachel Rizzo. She's a senior fellow from the Atlantic Council, and she joins us from Vilnius, where NATO leaders are gathered for their annual meeting. Now, membership very much on the minds of everyone at this NATO summit. Of course, good news for Sweden, Turkey. Let's be precise on that here. Turkey has agreed, or the president has agreed, to push for ratification of Sweden's membership in NATO in the Turkish parliament. That is what he has agreed to. Now, you have called this a classic case of geopolitical tit for tat. Now, could you explain for us, from Ankara's point of view, what has Ankara given and what has Ankara got?
Absolutely. This has been an ongoing negotiation for the past year after Finland and Sweden both dropped their historical military neutrality in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February of 22. And we've been waiting to see whether or not Turkey would be willing to drop its opposition to Sweden joining the alliance. And that ended up happening last night. And basically, the reason that they were stalling on this was they wanted to use this opportunity to extract some concessions from Sweden, namely an arms embargo that Sweden had placed on Turkey. And they felt that Sweden was too not tough enough on members of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, terrorists in Turkey's eyes, and a internationally agreed upon terrorist organization. So they were able to get some language on that they agreed to. They were also able to get language from the United States, although it's not in the communique, talking about the sale of F-16s to Turkey. So all in all, I think it was a win for both sides, and a win definitely before the outset of the summit, which started this morning.
All right. Ukraine, though, would be in a rather different situation. If I can quote here, you said President Recep Tayyip Erdogan would not have changed his tune if he had not seen this move as in his interest. So if we apply that to Ukraine, the movers and shakers in NATO need to see it as in their interest to grant Ukraine membership in NATO, for them to give the go-ahead and for the 31 member states to reach consensus on at least starting a membership action plan for Ukraine. But that is not happening, at least now. Why do you think that's so?
This has been a pretty frustrating moment, I think, for what is now 31 NATO allies. You know, when you work on a communique such as the one that will come out of this NATO summit, you sort of have to find the lowest common denominator of language that each and every ally will agree on. Remember, NATO is a consensus organization. So any agreement that comes out of the alliance needs to be made at consensus. It can't be consensus -1. And there's some question about the willingness, I think, of certain NATO members, the United States being one of them, to really grant Ukraine what it is looking for. And that is a clear pathway to NATO membership. We really want to avoid a situation that we had in 2008, where NATO allies at that summit said Ukraine will eventually join, but gave them no pathway as to how or when, which just invited Russian aggression. But we're really struggling now trying to figure out what that language looks like. I think the U.S. is still nervous about escalation, what this might mean for the future relationship with Russia. They want to avoid getting pulled into the war, of course. So let's see what happens on this first day of the summit here. The communique should be out, hopefully in the next little while.
All right, a lot of emphasis here on language, but beyond language, there have to be concrete deliverables. We've heard various versions of possibilities for Ukraine, so a membership action plan, or bypassing that entirely and setting different benchmarks set at different points for Ukraine. All this for you, does that boil down to the same thing, benchmarks that for some reason, certainly the US, possibly Germany as well, they are reluctant to set out for Ukraine, even if the timeline is an extended one. They don't even want to give a timeline.
So I think it's good to remember that 90% of the meaning of NATO membership comes down to Article 5, which is the collective defense clause, which says that an attack against one is an attack against all. It basically requires by treaty NATO countries to come to the aid of another country should they be invaded. And that's really where the difficulty comes from. bilateral security agreements, which we should see coming out of this alliance or from this summit from most of the G7 countries. South Korea, Japan are also here, as well as some other G7 members. So we'll see some bilateral security agreements and very strong language in terms of that, in terms of some long-term security guarantees. But for Ukraine, that's just not the same thing. And for many, especially Eastern flank countries in NATO, that's just not the same thing as a clear pathway for NATO to, or for Ukraine to eventually join NATO. And that's really where the difficulties still lie.
And final question here, Ms. Rizzo. You have said it's not that the U.S. does not want Ukraine to join NATO now. It likely does not want it to join ever. I have a hard time imagining a scenario where membership actually happens. Those are fairly clear, fairly bold language relative to others that I've heard. Do you see any scenario in which this membership, or at least some plan or some timeline, could actually happen? Final question.
Honestly, you know, as an analyst that looks at NATO, I have to sort of remove the emotions from this and look at it clearly and honestly. And unfortunately, I don't really see a clear pathway right now where the United States would be on board for Ukraine's NATO membership or for offering extremely clear language of how to lay that out. You know, I think that the United States has been timid, of course, in their support for Ukraine over the last 18 months. Part of that reason is that they aren't obligated by treaty to defend them. But the question that I always come back to is, if they were a member of NATO, would we come to the defense of Ukraine? And if we didn't, what would that mean for the entire NATO security architecture? I think NATO leaders or U.S. leaders ask themselves that same question, which why to me, this still seems like it would be a really, really difficult proposition, even 5 or 10 years down the line.
Thanks for that. Rachel Rizzo speaking from the Atlantic Council.